The China and Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on Africa-China relations through innovative training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.co.za.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden, the senior China-Africa researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, there is a very serious situation unfolding in your neighborhood down in southern Africa where 11 million people are now facing crisis levels of food insecurity, drought. Wildlife is suffering. Livestock is under pressure. It's hard to overstate just how serious the situation is. And then on top of that, in places like Zimbabwe and Mozambique, there were cyclones, and climate change has had a dramatic effect in many parts of Africa as well. Now, all of this gets to food and food insecurity and the growing levels of food insecurity tied to the inability to grow agriculture. Now, tying into all of this is the complex nature of African agriculture that, unlike other parts of the world, particularly where I come from in the United States, where agriculture has now become industrialized, vastly more efficient, we're still talking about a situation in Africa where it is family farms. It is it's lots of subsistence farming. And then you put on all of the calamities that go on to that, including drought, civil conflict, all the different things. It makes for a very, very serious situation about food insecurity and agricultural output. And so, Cobus, we're going to talk today about agriculture and all that goes into it and where the Chinese are actually now starting to play an increasingly important role in providing advice and consultations, and then at the same time opening up their market to African agricultural products.
Yeah, this is a very big issue, and it's a big issue that goes far beyond Africa. Because, Africa is one of the areas in the world with the last really usable arable land. And so there's a big push both in development circles internationally and in African development circles to try and get agribusiness to be a development engine in Africa. The problem is that all these family farms that you mentioned, the last thing you want is to chase all those people away and amalgamate those farms into big monoculture, maize or soy farms the way that you would see in Iowa. Because A, it's environmentally a nightmare, and B, those people, kind of going into ill-equipped, under-resourced cities is just going to make everything worse. You don't want to destroy those rural economies. You want to turn them into something that's more productive and that produces more jobs and more revenue, and that then produces products that actually can be shipped to places like China. So it's a very complicated issue that's going to affect food security around the whole world, but particularly in Africa.
And allocating land, as you know, in South Africa is a highly, highly sensitive issue where history gets into the mix on that. And so who owns the land and how the land is shared and doing land reform adds another layer of complication on that. So let's get into China-Africa agricultural issues. And the last time we talked about this, I think, when was that? 4, 5, maybe 6 years ago, when Professor Deborah Browdegem from Johns Hopkins University wrote her book, Will Africa Feed China? Now, that was a very controversial book because it really played on the stereotype that I have to say is still present today, that China is coming to Africa to colonize, to take over land, and to export some of its people in order to be able to feed China. Now, that's still around today a little bit. You see it on Twitter and on the margins and the fringes, but I think Deborah did a great job at kind of debunking that myth. And so now we're going to get to the substance of what it is. And we're thrilled to have on the program for the first time Lu Xinqing, who's an associate program officer for China-Africa Agricultural Cooperation at AGRA, which is the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Xinqing.
Hi, hello, hi both. I'm really thrilled to be here today.
Well, it is great to have you. It's a topic we have not afforded enough attention to, and it's one where I think there's a lot of opportunity to discuss, again, some of the pros and cons of what the Chinese are doing in Africa. I think before we get our conversation started, let's introduce a little bit about what AGRA is so people understand kind of where you're coming from. AGRA, right now, from what I understand, you guys are prioritizing 11 different countries, and you're working in mainly 3 different areas: the Guinea Savannah Zone, which includes Ghana, Nigeria, Mali, and Burkina Faso; the East African Highlands in Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and Tanzania; and the Miombo Woodlands in Malawi and Mozambique. Why don't you, maybe before we get into the issues, tell us a little bit more about AGRA and how it was founded and what do you guys do?
Yeah, sure. So AGRA stands for the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. Maybe you heard of this term, Green Revolution, which happened basically in Southeast Asia. But actually we are founded in 2006, and it was following a call by the former UN Secretary General, Kofi Annan. He called for a uniquely African Green Revolution. So that's how AGRA was funded. We are a purely African-led and African-based institution, and our goal is, as you said, to increase the productivity and help improving the livelihood in the smallholder farmers in these 11 countries that we work.
Now, you are independently funded, though, right? Or are you funded by governments? Are you nonprofit, independent, state-funded? What's that? Where do you come from on that side?
So we actually have a partnership for funding. Some of the major donors we have are, for example, Gates Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation. Some other donors include DFID from UK, USAID, and other government funding. But these donors, they choose very specific areas they want to work with us.
The Chinese government also runs agricultural demonstration centers in Africa, frequently in collaboration with Chinese agricultural corporations. Can you explain a little bit about how AGRA's work is different from those demonstration centers?
Yeah, sure. So this goes back to what AGRA does in China-Africa cooperation, because what I just described, AGRA, we have 300 people. Everyone is actually African, mostly Kenyan, but apart from me, I'm the only Chinese there. So the China-Africa program only started about 2 years ago in 2017. It was under the support, of course, of our board chair and our PIATA, which is the donor partnership group. What we mainly do is 3 different pillars, 3 different value propositions, if I may. The first one is how we strengthen African government state capacity. Second is how we link more Chinese investment, more Chinese technology transfer to Africa. And third is to build high-level knowledge sharing and learning sharing platforms, for example, using one of our biggest forum in Africa, AGRF. So I guess your question goes back to what are we doing in terms of technology transfer? Because these, as you said, these agriculture technology demonstration center, shortened as ATDCs, there are 23 of them on the African continent. They are mainly built by Chinese aid, and in cooperation with Chinese corporations or universities. However, some of these ATDCs are not maximizing their value because they were not linked to the local private sector. They were not the technology transferred were not taken to scale. So that's how one of AGRA's vision is to scale up the proven technology from China. And we work with ATDCs. We link them with local private sector, the farmer associations, the local research institutions to take this technology to scale. So this is one part of our work.
What's interesting for me is that my background's obviously in China. You know China very well, obviously, as well. I was in Guizhou last year for a few weeks, and Guizhou, for those of you not familiar, is rural China, one of the poorer parts of China, and it really typifies in many ways the interior parts of China, where it's still very much family farms. I mean, very, very small plots of land. It's not mechanized that much. We're talking about people who are living on mountains and doing the kind of tabletop, the step farming, if you will, that you see in a lot of the pictures. And again, from an American point of view, it looks highly inefficient because we come from a culture where, again, we have industrial farming. And as Cobus pointed out, there are benefits to that because we're able to do massive amounts of output. But at the end of the day, there also is a consequence in terms of big agriculture. The quality goes down sometimes. And at the same time, the environmental impact can be much higher. And so it's very interesting when you compare China's experience in agriculture with where Africa is today. And I'd like you, as somebody who kind of sits in between these two worlds, to kind of describe what are the similarities and differences between rural Chinese agriculture and what the kinds of projects you're working on in Africa and what your observations are in places like Ghana, Nigeria, Mali, all the different places you've been to.
Yeah, I think first of all, you're absolutely correct. China and Africa are very similar in terms of the smallholder farmer structure. In terms of how I remember this book I read, how Asia works. The first chapter is all about agriculture, and the main idea it talks about is you need to increase the productivity at family farm level. So this is the first step of development instead of, as you say, consolidating the land and mechanize everything. So I will say 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the situation of China is very similar to Africa. However, China has moved on, so we also see more and more consolidating of land, mechanization cooperatives, farmer cooperatives. So for now, we are moving to high horsepower tractors, machineries. But I will say some of these practices and Chinese policy on how to organize farmers, integrate farmers, like 20 years ago, Chinese affordable and suitable technologies like small-scale machineries are still very, very relevant to Africa today.
And, moving on, hooking onto that, what kind of recommendations or maybe rather, what kind of obstacles do you see to making African family farms more productive at the farm level? Like what are some of the main things that are keeping that from happening?
Yeah, if we look at the value chain of the African agriculture, from the beginning, there is input, including seed, fertilizer, pesticide. Frankly, they are still not reaching the smallholder farmers in Africa. And this is a problem of lack of local production. This is a problem of distribution and also farmers' awareness. Sometimes they simply don't know how to use this improved input. And then you move on to the value chain. There's a problem with market. As you know, China and Africa, we all have fragmented smallholder farmers. So one of the key problems is how do you aggregate the agriculture output? One thing that China actually invested a lot 30 years ago is to invest in wholesale market in the rural China, village part of the China. So this enables the farmers to sell their products to the bigger market and really and stimulate this market. And then you move on to even financial inclusion. We're talking about the whole policy issue. I would say there are obstacles along the value chain in every stage.
Support for this podcast comes from the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University School of Journalism in Johannesburg. The ACRP provides reporting grants, workshops, and other professional development opportunities for both African and Chinese journalists. Follow the ACRP on Twitter at Wits China Africa or visit africachinareporting.co.za for information about grants and upcoming seminars.
Agriculture is not one of the areas that really comes up a lot in the discussion when we talk about China-Africa. As we said, we talk about China-Africa on a podcast every week. We do it every day on our social media. And I have to be honest with you, it doesn't really surface to one of the key issues, not like debt, sustainability, or fishing, or a lot of the other issues. But farming really is pretty low down. So I don't think a lot of people actually know what the Chinese are doing in Africa when it comes to this type of agricultural partnership, cooperation, advising, whatever it may be. Can you just give us a broad overview of what some of the different areas of engagement happen between Chinese and Africans in terms of agriculture?
Yeah, sure. This is a very broad topic also. I think maybe first we look at different buckets in terms of aid and investment and trade. Although I would also say aid and economic activities is very intertwined in agriculture field. But within aid, one of the biggest initiative, as you mentioned, is the Agriculture Technology Demonstration Center. This was announced, I think, in 2006 on the FOCAC. And then China started building these about 23 ATDCs in 23 countries in Africa. And also along with other aid initiatives such as dispatching Chinese experts to African countries to transfer technologies like fission, like mushroom growing or horticulture growing, etc. So this is the whole aid part. And then the second part is economic, let's say investment and trade. So there's a lot of trading going on. China is a big consumer market, but a lot of trading we see is in cash crop, of course, cotton, avocado, sesame, and coffee. These are the biggest ones. In terms of investment, of course, also in cash crop, but because Agra, I forgot to mention this before, Agra is mostly focused on staple crops such as rice, cassava, potato, maize. So in this field, we don't see a lot of Chinese investments in Africa. Some of the bigger ones, as I know, there's a big Wanbao rice farm in Mozambique in the Limpopo irrigation scheme area. There is a rice seed production scheme in Nigeria by one of the Chinese pioneering company called CGCOC. And also there's some machinery trading, agricultural machinery trading from China to Africa, but these are not scaled up yet either.
So is the idea that the rice produced, these staple crops that are produced, would they be feeding that local community? Is it supposed to be also traded across borders, especially now that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is coming in next year? Or is it even also targeted for export overseas?
This is a good question. As far as I know, for now, these rice produced are only for domestic market, even not to sold to Maputo, as in Mozambique, because this rice farm is located in Gaza province. So they mainly sell to local Gaza province. Maybe 20%, a small part of it will be transported to Maputo, the capital area, and very little it will be exported because, frankly, local produced rice are not very competitive in terms of price. A lot of problem we see in Africa is they import a lot of staple crop, rice, maize, because import price is even much lower than local produced rice.
So that brings up a really interesting dilemma that I think comes up because we just had the China International Import Expo, which is the big showcase for China to open up its market. China was trying to encourage a lot of African countries to sell agriculture. Now also because the Chinese are cutting back their agricultural purchases from the United States, they are going around the world, including to parts of Africa, to look for new sources of supply. So this brings up a very kind of delicate issue. If Africa starts to export more food to China, say avocados from Kenya or beef from Namibia or oranges from South Africa, you name it, there's a long list. Given the food insecurity issues that exist on the continent and the amount of hard currency that's being used to buy food imported from other countries, does it make sense for African countries to focus on the export market when in fact they really should be focusing on the domestic market, both in their own countries and through the free trade zones selling across borders on the continent? Where do you think that the focus should be?
Well, I have to say first, I'm not an expert in this topic in exportation. Just my own opinion, personal opinion, I think you need both. I don't see a trade-off between these two. Of course, you have limited budget, limited attention from the government, but you do have to develop both because you don't view the farmers only as producers or farmers. You should view them as agribusinessmen, and they are also consumers, right? So the whole idea about exportation or growing cash crop is that the farmers can earn more money, they will improve the livelihood, and then they can enter the market as a consumer because they can buy more things. This will in turn, stimulate to boost the whole market, in my view.
I think one of the challenges of an African green revolution is that a lot of the templates that are set by the older green revolution, the different kind of agricultural revolutions that we've seen in Asia and in the US, aren't necessarily applicable in Africa without massive social and environmental cost. So as Eric mentioned before, the kind of a US industrial style farm might be more efficient in terms of the amount of of yield that it produces, but it produces it in a completely different kind of land stewardship system, kind of where in order to start a farm like that, you would have to disenfranchise lots and lots of people and essentially, ruin lots of already established rural economies. At the same time, those rural economies are frequently not particularly efficient. How do you see, what are the particularly African aspects of a new African green revolution? Like how will Africa change what we understand as a green revolution in the future?
Yeah. First of all, I think you're absolutely correct also, because when Kofi Annan called for the Green Revolution, he specifically said we need a unique African Green Revolution. One thing I would like to point out is, this whole we are in the era of climate change. So the whole idea about Green Revolution is increase usage of fertilizer, increase usage of pesticide may not apply in this era anymore. So what we are promoting here in Africa is more about climate smart agriculture practices. For example, we use more organic fertilizer or other type of control release fertilizer. So this is something to take into control. How do we incorporate agricultural resilience, adaptation into the Green Revolution here?
Yeah, it's really interesting if to compare kind of what the Chinese are doing in both in China and then obviously some of the things that are happening in Africa. And I guess I'm curious to hear your take on land reform and the regulatory and the public policy side of things. If you read Deborah Brautigim's book, that's one of the areas that she talks about in China that was very effective was the restructuring of the marketplace and land reform, and that made farmers more productive and had different incentives for farmers as well to sell into the marketplace. In Africa, we don't have an Africa. We have a patchwork of countries that all have different policies, all have different levels of governance. How much does this governance question and the public policy part of it play into the agricultural reform that you're talking about in some of the different countries that agro works in?
Yeah, land, or let's call it institutional reform, is a major contributing factor of China's agricultural transformation. That's correct. I remember there's a famous professor called Professor Huang Jikun. He is within Peking University, and his theory says there are 4 key contributing factors of the productivity gain in China from 1970s to 2000. And frankly, before 1980s, for the first maybe 20 years, the biggest driver is farmer incentivization by institutional reform, which is in China we call it an household responsibility system, HRS. So this is about, as we go back to, we already talked about it before, this is about how to incentivize smallholder farmers, help them to get access to improved seed, fertilizer, help them to use better farming practices and increase productivity on the small land, and this is the biggest driver in the first place. And I do think a lot of African countries have a lot to learn from Chinese policy on how to incentivize farmer.
Are they doing that? Are the Chinese bringing over some of their regulatory models to try and work with African governments on how to implement some of the things that worked in China, or is this just something speculative on your part?
Well, for example, AGRA is supporting high-level knowledge sharing and and policy dialogues on what we have is Agriculture Green Revolution Forum, AGRF. In China, there is also China-Africa Agriculture Forum. There have been cases being shared on these forums. We also organize learning tours, for example, for African officials to learn these policies, institution, arrangement, and investments priorities. These efforts are going on. Another thing is, there is very interesting model in China called land use transfer online platform. One of the biggest is called tuliu.com. They have, I don't remember the numbers, but millions of farmers registered on this platform where they can basically lease out land and increase the productivity of the land by, some farmers, they don't want to farm their own land anymore and they can lease it out to higher productivity farmers. So this is also, in this digital era, I think this is an interesting model to look at in China.
Yeah, that's certainly an interesting model in the case of South Africa as well, where land reform is particularly complicated. Are you seeing some of these models and some of these policies starting to actually land on the ground in Africa?
I'm not an expert in land reform. I know, for example, I think Rwanda has been carrying out some of the land tenure registration efforts, which is very, very admirable.
The programs you work at on AGRA, where you partner with the Chinese, how does that differ from what, say, the U.S. or Europeans or other countries are doing in the same space? Do you get to compare and contrast some of the different programs from different countries?
Well, I think this is a big area, so this is not a competition. Let's rather say it's cooperation with each other.
No. I'm not suggesting. I'm not suggesting it's a competition. I want to compare the different styles and the different methods and some of the different approaches. So it's not a competition. It's just more about the U.S. approach may focus more on technology. It may focus more on different ideas. The Chinese or the Europeans may focus on different areas. I'm just going to understand the differences between the Chinese approach and maybe from different countries and different organizations.
Yeah, so your question is about AGRA's approach or Chinese approach. Well,
how the Chinese approach this differently from other countries.
Got it. Well, yes, I think, first of all, Chinese approach, aid and investment are very intertwined. So this is an interesting aspect. A lot of, the investment, some are private sector, a lot of SOE, state-owned companies' investment in Africa, they are somehow linked back to government support. So this is one difference, I will say. Second is, I think Chinese approach is always a package. There's no purely, let's say, funding support to NGO. It's always a package of technology. There's a technology, capacity building, and funding together. This is the second difference, I think. And third, China has huge funding capacity. So this is one thing. And as also trading opportunities, because China is a growing consumer market. So I think on the economic side, trade and investment is a huge potential for cooperating with China.
Are Chinese agricultural companies involved in some of this work as well?
Well, using an example I mentioned before, maybe in Mozambique, this rice production and processing company in China is invested mainly by China Africa Development Fund. Well, what they do is end-to-end from production to processing and packaging and sell to the local domestic market. They also work with smallholder farmers, actually, to transfer the technology. This is what we call outgrower scheme. So basically, the Chinese companies, they provide an input, seed, fertilizer on credit, and then during the harvest season, they will deduct the cost from the harvest, from the output from the farmers. So this is, as I said, they are not purely like a commercial model. Of course, they want to earn money, but they always have a social impact component. So they work with the local farmers, and they are also supported somehow by the Chinese government in this case.
It's so interesting to see what happens. And for me, the lasting impression that I have of my time in Guizhou last year, and I've been going to the countryside. I spent probably a year and a half living in the Chinese countryside, maybe 20 years ago, and then I've gone back periodically. The thing that stands out to you in China, which I don't think is the case in Africa, there are no adults there. It's the most remarkable thing you've ever seen. There are senior citizens and there are babies. It's incredible. Well, that makes sense because in rural Africa, a lot of Africa is urbanizing, much the same way that China urbanized 20 years ago. And the young people go to the cities for jobs. And so you have a 75-year-old taking care of a 2-year-old on a farm. It is really the most remarkable thing to see.
And women.
And women, yeah. Well, even a lot of women are going into the factories and cities as well. But it just was, after a week or two there, you become numb to it, but you realize, wow, there's nobody between the ages of, say, 20 and 50. It's really,
I think it's true.
It's incredible.
In African countries, I went to Nigeria and Mozambique a lot. I see most of the farmers are women farmers. And maybe, as you say, with the urbanization trend, women will also go to cities to find jobs. So the question to us is really how to empower youth to change the image of agriculture. It's not drudgery. It's not about hard work in the farmland. We can make agriculture more sexy and more attractive to young people, right? I think you can use digital. There's a lot of digital tools first. You can use small-scale machineries to reduce the drudgery. And then the whole goal is to engage more young people back in the agriculture sector.
And it has so much potential for employment. Also, there's this idea of becoming more self-sustaining and not having to purchase food from outside and to conserve those hard-earned, hard currency that can be used for other purposes. So there's so many benefits to developing the agricultural sector in Africa. And so we're so excited to have had the chance to meet you and to hear more about what AGRA's doing, to hear more about what the Chinese are doing in Africa. I think it's one of these things, too, where the Chinese bring a lot of very, very tangible, relevant experience from developing world situations. I got into a fight the other day on Twitter, which is not unusual. People get into Twitter's a nasty place, and I posted a story about how China is sending desert specialists to the Sahara, and several people, Africans, all came back and said, "Well, what does China know about deserts? This is ridiculous. Why are the Chinese sending desert specialists to Africa?" And so I did a screen grab of a map and literally then circled the entire Gobi Desert, which is descending down into Beijing and into China at an alarming pace. And the Chinese have done a remarkable job at trying to slow the pace of the Gobi Desert. But the Gobi Desert represents as much of a threat to China as the Sahara and the spreading of the Sahara does in Africa. And so what the Chinese have done in terms of planting massive amounts of trees along the border of the Gobi to try and slow that pace down is absolutely admirable. And there's a lot of people who have worked on that, and they're now in Africa doing it. So I just thought that was a really good experience. But it's one of these communication challenges that we're up against with the Chinese, that people just don't seem to understand what the Chinese are doing in Africa. And this was a great example of doing something really phenomenal, but people don't know, and that skepticism people are so quick to jump to. So, Xingqing, I think you are really helping and to change perceptions out there. So I'm really happy that you're doing that. So I just went off on a little tangent there, but I just thought it was a worthwhile kind of anecdote to show how important it is that people like you and other Chinese who are actually in Africa doing things to implement change and bringing those partnerships to life. So thank you for that. We really appreciate it. So we really appreciate you taking the time to join us today on the show. If people want to get in touch with AGRA, do you have any suggestions on what they're doing? And if they want to reach out to you, is there any way? Are you on social media, in Twitter or Facebook or any of those?
Yeah, sure. Twitter is a nasty place, but I am actually on Twitter. So you can find me, or you can also access our official website, agra.org.
Fantastic. I'll put all the links to AGRA and also to Xingqing as well. Twitter can be a nasty place, but in our little part of the world with China, Africa, we try to keep it as sane and civil. And by the way, a lot of Chinese ambassadors and embassies are now on Twitter as well. So and that, I must add, is a rather entertaining part of Twitter. Watching Chinese ambassadors now get into little Twitter fights with everybody is a rather entertaining pastime, which I think everybody highly, highly recommend you check that out. Be careful if you're going to criticize China in a country like Zimbabwe or in South Africa. You had better be ready that the ambassador may come back at you and may have a comment or two for you. So it's really quite remarkable. It's very entertaining, I must say. So Twitter can be a nasty place, but at the same time, very entertaining. So thank you so much, Xingqing. We really appreciate it. Lu Xingqing is the Associate Program Officer for China-Africa Agriculture Cooperation at the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, AGRA. She is the only one on the AGRA team there from China, but she's really doing a lot of work to integrate and manage the partnerships between the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Commerce, the Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences, the Gates Foundation in China, all these different groups to try and bring some of the Chinese best practices into Africa. So thank you so much, Xingqing, for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Cobus, at the end of the day, there's really no issue that is more important than agriculture right now. I mean, that's a pretty bold statement when we talk about the China-Africa relationship that involves military, trade, investment, all of these different things. You know, all the tech coverage that we've been doing over the past week for our newsletter and things like that. I think it's all secondary to food. And particularly because of climate change and all of the politics in places like Zimbabwe and South Africa related to land, it creates an enormous amount of instability when the food supply and the land is not stable. And so getting this right is so important. And it's one of these areas where I think the Chinese do a lot, and they don't get anywhere near the credit that they deserve for the contributions they're making. You know, I'm not always favorable or partial to the Chinese. This is one of those areas where I think they're actually doing an enormous amount of good in terms of deploying people who have relevant, practical, tangible skills into areas that need assistance, and they're doing it. That being said, the other side of this, which is opening up the market to African goods, I think there's a lot more that the Chinese can do. And I'm a little bit frustrated watching how the Chinese talk a good game, like at the China International Import Expo, of like, sell to China, come to our market. But yet, at the same time, make the import restrictions very, very high. A lot of importers complain about enormous amounts of red tape, how complicated it is just to get your products into China. So if China really wants to make a big impact in African agriculture, it will streamline that import process. Not necessarily on the quality side, because we don't want to import bugs and pests and diseases and things like that, but just on the red tape side of things. I don't know. I mean, I'm way, way out of my field of expertise here on these kinds of things, but these are just some of the things that I've heard from various importers.
Yes, no, I've certainly heard the same thing. And, you know, I think here we have a real tension between China on the one hand, being a global south country, and I think in lots of ways legitimately still can call itself a developing country, and in other ways, how China is also an economic superpower, you know, because on the one hand, this kind of like South-South trade and South-South cooperation is incredibly important, and it's something that China is very naturally set to do. But at the same time, China is also a lot like Europe, you know, or like the US, in the sense that it has a lot of trade barriers up. It's a whole nightmare to get your products into any of those markets. And when you speak to South African farmers, they complain just as much about Europe as they do about China. So it's a difficult question, but it's a really crucial one, because not only does agriculture have to, in some kind of way, become more climate resilient, agriculture itself can be either a massive driver of climate change or a mitigant of climate change. You know, you can actually use agriculture to try and make the climate change situation better. But you have to then be super smart about this particular agriculture that you do. And that, you know, it sounds like there is interesting kind of movement in that direction in this case.
Yeah, and let's not forget about the importance of water. And in many ways, Africa does mirror China as well. So southern China is a place that has too much water. Northern China is a place that has too little water. So in parts of southern Africa, obviously with cyclones, and in Mozambique, they had the floods this year. We've had issues of too much water, and then what to do, how to capture that, how to manage it. Obviously, where you live, Cobus, water is probably the paramount security issue, I would imagine. I mean, you last year were on the verge of running out for the entire country. And so China certainly is grappling with water issues in the north. So, and they have this massive, massive project. Only a communist country could do something like this, where they are pushing water up against the flow. So they're bringing water from the south to the north. But it just goes, I think, to your point here, is that they are a global south country in many respects. When we talk about agriculture and these land issues, China, though it has big cities, it also has this big landmass that is in many ways still very, very much in need of development. Remember that China has about 20% of the world's population with about 3 to 4% of the world's arable land. And that is a huge challenge for them. And they have now had to shift purchasing more food and importing more food as well. So they are food dependent as well, just like Africa is. So in that sense, there are some very interesting parallels there on water, on climate change, on the desertification of the country, and certainly the desertification of parts along where the Sahel and the Sahara are. So lots of interesting things to look at. By the way, everybody, we're going to be doing a lot more of this in 2020. And so we'll have some news to share with you in the new year about that. But we are working with some partners on agriculture and health and the intersection between the two. So if this is a topic that interests you, we hope that you will follow our newsletter, our website, and certainly this podcast as well. Speaking of our newsletter, we're doing it every day, getting really some very positive feedback from everybody. If you are serious about China, Africa, and this is something you do for a living, we highly, highly recommend that you take a look at this daily newsletter that Cobus and I are putting out. It's really an intelligence brief. I mean, there is nothing else like it anywhere in the world in terms of every single day we're sitting on social media, on the news sites, filtering them all out, applying a high level of journalistic editorial standards to the selection of each story, and then creating original content and analysis around it. So this is what helps you make sense. The kinds of people that we have who have subscribed to this, venture capital investors, senior officials in various governments in the US, China, and in several African countries as well. So those are the people that are looking at this. If you're in a category of needing to know about China, Africa, then this newsletter is for you. Go to ChinaAfricaProject.com/subscribe. And if you sign up, just use the promo code podcast, and we'll give you a free month just to try it out. So that'll do it for this edition of the China in Africa podcast. For Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus at Stadinsky or Eric at E. Olander. And be sure to sign up for the weekly China in Africa email newsletter by going to www.ChinaAfricaProject.com.